The privileged halls of Hamilton Academy hold two dangerous assumptions: that a black girl must be lying about her Pentagon father, and that elite schools are beyond the reach of national threats. Both illusions shatter on Parents' Day. As Mrs. Reynolds's condescending smile freezes on her face, Colonel Marcus Mitchell enters the classroom not as the janitor or delivery man they imagined, but as the strategic mind that safeguards a nation. His daughter Zoe watches silently. Vindication. Eclipsed by dawning fear, because her father isn't just there to prove a point. He's there to neutralize the breach that followed him into a school where no one believed the truth until it walked through the door wearing stars on its shoulders. Zoe Mitchell struggled to keep her hands from shaking as she adjusted her navy blue blazer in the mirror. The Hamilton Academy crest felt heavy on her chest, like a target marking her as different. Every morning was the same ritual: wake up, put on the uniform of privilege, and prepare for another day of not quite belonging. "Zoe, breakfast is ready," her father's voice called from downstairs, the familiar military precision in his tone oddly comforting. "Coming, Dad," Zoe replied, taking one last look at her reflection. At 12 years old, she was already learning to wear two faces, the confident one she showed at home and the guarded one she needed at school. Downstairs, Colonel Marcus Mitchell sat at the kitchen table reviewing something on his tablet. Even in casual clothes, her father carried himself with unmistakable authority. Back straight, movements economical, eyes that missed nothing. "Got everything ready for today?" he asked, sliding a plate of eggs and toast across the table. Zoe nodded, sitting down to eat. "We have to do presentations on our parents' careers today." Her father raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "I'm going to tell them about your work at the Pentagon," Zoe said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. Marcus gave her a measured look. "Just remember what I always tell you." I know, Zoe sighed. "Some things are classified. I'll only talk about the general stuff." "Smart girl," Marcus said, ruffling her curly hair. "Now eat up. We need to leave in 10 minutes. Hamilton Academy stood like a fortress of brick and privilege in one of Washington, D.C.'s most exclusive neighborhoods. Zoe climbed out of her father's modest sedan, immediately spotting the line of luxury cars dropping off her classmates. She straightened her shoulders, grabbed her backpack, and gave her dad a quick wave. "Have a good day," Marcus called. "Remember what I said." "Got it, Dad," Zoe replied, turning toward the imposing building. As she walked through the hallways, Zoe felt the familiar feeling of being watched, not with outright hostility, but with something almost worse. Curiosity tinged with doubt, as if her very presence was a question mark. "Zoe!" A friendly voice broke through her thoughts. Emma Gonzalez jogged up beside her, her dark hair bouncing in a ponytail. Unlike most of the kids at Hamilton, Emma had never made Zoe feel like an outsider. "Ready for Mrs. Reynolds's class?" Emma asked, falling into step beside her. Zoe managed to smile. "I guess. Are you talking about your mom's job today?" Emma nodded. "Yeah, but there's not much exciting about being a nurse. What about you?" "I'm going to talk about my dad." They walked into Mrs. Reynolds's classroom together, taking their usual seats near the middle. The room was already buzzing with excitement as students compared notes on their presentations. "My dad just closed a deal worth $100 million, bragged Jason Whitfield, a blond boy whose father owned half the real estate in Northern Virginia. "Well, my mom had dinner with the French ambassador last night," countered Sophia Chen, not to be outdone. Mrs. Reynolds swept into the room exactly as the bell rang. She was tall and elegant, with ash-blonde hair pulled into a perfect chignon, and clothes that screamed designer. At 45, she was considered one of Hamilton's most respected teachers, having taught the children of 2 former cabinet members. "Good. Morning, class," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone teachers perfect, warm on the surface but with steel underneath. "I trust you're all prepared for today's presentations." Her gaze swept the room, lingering a moment longer on Zoe than on the others. Zoe had noticed this before, how Mrs. Reynolds seemed to expect less from her. With other students, she pushed and challenged. With Zoe, her voice often took on a patronizing tone, as if she were speaking to someone much younger. "We'll go in alphabetical order by last name," Mrs. Reynolds announced, consulting her tablet. "Mitchell, that means you're 5th. Zoe's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected to go so early. As the first 4 students gave their presentations, all perfectly polished accounts of their parents' impressive careers, her anxiety grew. "Zoe Mitchell!" Mrs. Reynolds called, her tone suggesting she'd already found Zoe's performance lacking. Zoe walked to the front of the classroom, 24 pairs of eyes following her every move. "My name is Zoe Mitchell," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My presentation is about my dad's job." "Speak up, Zoe," Mrs. Reynolds instructed. Zoe cleared her throat and continued louder. "My dad's name is Marcus Mitchell, and he's a colonel in the Air Force. He works at the Pentagon in the Office of Special Investigations." The room fell silent for a split second before a snicker broke out from Jason's corner. It spread like wildfire, until half the class was giggling behind their hands. Mrs. Reynolds didn't silence them. Instead, a smug smile played at her lips. "The Pentagon," she repeated, her voice dripping with exaggerated interest. "And what does he do there? Is he the Secretary of Defense, perhaps?" She turned toward the class with a theatrical wink that sent them into another fit of laughter. Zoe felt heat rising in her cheeks. "No, ma'am. He's an intelligence officer. He oversees—" "I'm sure he does," Mrs. Reynolds interrupted, her voice condescending. "Perhaps next time we can stick to the truth rather than trying to impress everyone." Zoe stood frozen at the front of the room. "But I am telling the truth." "You may sit down now, Zoe," Mrs. Reynolds said firmly. "We have many presentations to get through today." As Zoe returned to her seat, her legs felt like lead. The sniggering continued around her, and she could hear Jason whispering, "Pentagon. Yeah, right. Probably the janitor." From beside her, Emma's hand shot up. "Mrs. Reynolds, Zoe isn't lying. I've met her dad. He is in the military." Mrs. Reynolds' smile tightened. "That's enough, Emma. Unless you'd like to join Zoe in detention for disrupting class." Emma's face reddened, but she fell silent, shooting Zoe an apologetic look. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Zoe moved through her classes mechanically, the humiliation of the morning weighing on her like a physical burden. By the time the final bell rang, all she wanted was to go home and forget this day had ever happened. Marcus was waiting in the car when Zoe emerged from school. One look at his daughter's face told him everything he needed to know. "Rough day?" he asked as Zoe slid into the passenger seat. "Yeah," Zoe mumbled, staring out the window. They drove in silence for a few minutes before Marcus spoke again. "Want to talk about it?" Zoe hesitated. Then the words spilled out. "We had to talk about our parents' jobs today. I told them you work at the Pentagon and everyone laughed at me. Even Mrs. Reynolds. She acted like I was making it up to sound important." Marcus's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but his voice remained calm. "I see. She made me look like a liar in front of everyone, Zoe continued, her voice cracking. Why don't you ever come to career day? Then maybe they'd believe me. You know why, Zoe? Marcus replied. My schedule doesn't always allow for those things. It's not fair, Zoe said bitterly. Everyone else's parents come to school stuff. Marcus pulled the car into their driveway before turning to face his daughter. People doubt what they don't understand, Zoe. Sometimes being underestimated can be an advantage. How is being called a liar an advantage? Zoe asked. Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, and Zoe saw her father's expression change instantly, becoming harder, more focused. I need to take this, Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. Go inside and start your homework. We'll talk more later. Later that night, unable to sleep, Zoe got up for a glass of water. As she passed by her bedroom window, a movement outside caught her eye. Looking down at the street, she saw a black SUV parked across from their house, its engine running. Zoe watched as a woman in a dark suit got out, spoke briefly into what looked like a radio on her wrist, then scanned the surrounding area before returning to the vehicle. Confused and a little frightened, Zoe went to her father's room and knocked softly. Dad, there's a car outside. I think someone's watching our house. Marcus, who seemed to be still awake despite the late hour, came to the window and looked out. His face betrayed no surprise. Don't worry about it, he said, placing a reassuring hand on Zoe's shoulder. Go back to bed. But who are they? Why are they outside our house? Zoe, Marcus said firmly. Some things are safer if you don't know. Trust me on this. Now go to sleep. The next day at school, Mrs. Reynolds seemed determined to continue Zoe's humiliation. As they discussed famous government buildings in Washington, D.C., she pointedly called on Zoe when they reached the Pentagon. Zoe, since your father supposedly works there, she said with a smirk, perhaps you can tell us something about the Pentagon that isn't in our textbooks. The class went quiet, most students grinning in anticipation of another embarrassing moment. But Zoe had spent the evening reading everything she could find about the Pentagon, determined not to be caught off guard again. The Pentagon has twice as many bathrooms as necessary, she said confidently. It was built in the 1940s when Virginia was still segregated, so they had to have separate bathrooms for white and black employees. After segregation ended, they just kept all the bathrooms. Mrs. Reynolds's smirk faltered slightly. She clearly hadn't expected Zoe to have an actual answer. Well, she said after a moment, that's correct, though hardly relevant to our discussion of architectural significance. And it has a hot dog stand in the central courtyard that Soviet missiles supposedly targeted during the Cold War, Zoe continued, warming to her subject. They thought it was the entrance to a secret bunker because they saw high-ranking officials going there every day, but they were just getting lunch. A few students laughed, not mockingly this time, but genuinely amused by the anecdote. Mrs. Reynolds' lips thinned. That's enough, Zoe. We need to move on. But the small victory gave Zoe a boost of confidence that lasted throughout the day. As the final bell rang, Mrs. Reynolds called her back as the other students filed out. Zoe, she said, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes cold. I understand. You're going through a phase where you feel the need to embellish the truth. Many children do. But continuing to insist on these Pentagon stories is becoming disruptive. I'm not making anything up, Zoe said firmly. Mrs. Reynolds leaned forward, her smile never reaching her eyes. If your father really works at the Pentagon, why not bring him in to prove it? Parents' Day is next week. That would settle everything. Wouldn't it? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. She was certain Zoe would back down, admit to lying, or make excuses why her father couldn't attend. Instead, Zoe met her gaze steadily. Fine. He will. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across Mrs. Reynolds's face, but she quickly masked it with a patronizing smile. Wonderful. I look forward to meeting him. That evening, Zoe approached her father with nervous determination. Marcus was at the kitchen table, laptop open, frowning at something on the screen. Dad, Zoe began hesitantly, there's Parents' Day at school next week. I really need you to come. Marcus looked up, his expression distracted. Parents' Day? You know how difficult it is for me to commit to school events, Zoe. I know, but... Zoe took a deep breath and explained the situation. Mrs. Reynolds's continued mockery, her challenge, the way she'd made Zoe a laughingstock among her classmates. As Zoe spoke, Marcus's expression gradually shifted from distracted to focused, then to something harder to read. By the time Zoe finished, her father's face had settled into a calm determination that Zoe recognized from rare occasions when Marcus was truly angry, but controlling it. I see, Marcus said simply. He closed his laptop. What day is this Parents' Day? Next Friday, Zoe said hopefully. Will you come? Marcus nodded once, decisively. Yes, I'll be there. Really? Zoe couldn't hide her surprise. Her father had never agreed so quickly to a school event before. Really? Marcus confirmed. I think it's time I met your teacher. Zoe felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Finally, Mrs. Reynolds would see the truth. Later that night, Marcus made another of his mysterious phone calls from his study. This time. Zoe was certain she heard her father mention Hamilton Academy and security protocols before the study door closed completely. Outside, the black SUV was back, parked in the same spot as before. But now, instead of feeling frightened by its presence, Zoe found it oddly reassuring. Something was happening. Something her father wasn't telling her about. But whatever it was, she was beginning to believe it might work in her favor. As she drifted off to sleep, Zoe thought about the look on Mrs. Reynolds' face when her father walked into that classroom. For the first time since the humiliating presentation, she found herself looking forward to going to school. The days leading up to Parents' Day crawled by with agonizing slowness. In class, Mrs. Reynolds had been wearing a particularly smug smile whenever she glanced at Zoe. Twice, she had made offhand comments about tall tales and vivid imaginations while looking directly at her. She thinks your dad isn't coming, Emma whispered during their Thursday math lesson. He'll be there, Zoe replied with more confidence than she felt. Though her father had promised to attend, Zoe knew how unpredictable Marcus's schedule could be. Just last month, he had missed Zoe's science fair because of some emergency at work. That evening at dinner, Zoe picked at her food nervously. You're still coming tomorrow, right? Marcus looked up from his plate. I said I would be there. Didn't I? Yeah, but sometimes things come up at work. Not tomorrow, Marcus said firmly. I've already cleared my schedule. Zoe nodded, relieved. Mrs. Reynolds doesn't believe you work at the Pentagon. She thinks I made it all up. Something flashed. In Marcus's eyes, a hardness Zoe rarely saw at home. Does she now? She's been making fun of me for it, Zoe continued. In front of everyone. Marcus set down his fork with deliberate calm. Tell me more about Mrs. Reynolds. Zoe described her teacher, her favoritism toward the wealthy students, her subtle put-downs, the way she seemed to enjoy humiliating Zoe. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Zoe finished, he simply said, "I see." The next morning, Zoe woke to find her father already dressed, not in his usual work attire, but in his full Air Force dress uniform, complete with decorations. On the kitchen counter lay a leather portfolio and an ID badge Zoe had never seen before. "Is that your Pentagon ID?" Zoe asked, reaching for it. Marcus gently moved it out of reach. "Yes, and it stays with me." Zoe noticed her father checking his watch repeatedly during breakfast, as if coordinating the timing of their departure with precision. When they finally got into the car, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then made a brief call. "We're leaving now." ETA 20 minutes. They rode in silence for several blocks before Zoe gathered the courage to ask, "Dad, are you okay? You seem different today." Marcus's expression softened. "I'm fine, Zoe. Just focused." "Are you mad about Mrs. Reynolds?" "Not mad," Marcus replied after a moment's consideration. "But I don't appreciate anyone calling my daughter a liar." As they approached Hamilton Academy, Zoe noticed something unusual. 2 black SUVs, identical to the one she'd seen outside their house, were parked across the street from the school. Men and women in dark suits stood beside them, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy morning. "Dad, who are those people?" Marcus glanced at them briefly. "Colleagues." "But why are they here?" "Support," Marcus said simply, pulling into the school's visitor parking lot. As they walked toward the entrance, Zoe felt a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Part of her couldn't wait to see Mrs. Reynolds' face when her father walked in. Another part worried that somehow something would go wrong. "Don't worry," Marcus said, as if reading her thoughts. "Everything will be fine." Inside, the school hallways were bustling with parents and students. Parents' Day at Hamilton Academy was always a major event, with many families using it as an opportunity to network and forge connections. They checked in at the front desk, where the secretary did a double-take when she saw Marcus's uniform and ID badge. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, her professional smile faltering slightly. "We weren't expecting... it's lovely to have you join us today." "Thank you," Marcus replied politely. "Could you direct us to Mrs. Reynolds' classroom?" "Of course. Room 112, just down that hallway on the right." As they walked, Zoe noticed other parents and staff giving them curious glances. Marcus's uniform and the Pentagon badge prominently displayed on his chest seemed to be attracting attention. "Why is everyone staring?" Zoe whispered. "People are curious about things they don't see every day," Marcus answered. They reached room 112, where a small crowd of parents and students had already gathered. Mrs. Reynolds stood at the front, perfectly, poised in a cream-colored blouse and navy skirt, greeting each family with practiced charm. When she spotted Zoe, a satisfied smirk crossed her face, clearly assuming she had come alone. Then her eyes shifted to Marcus, took in his imposing figure in full military dress, the ribbons and medals on his chest, and finally settled on the Pentagon badge displayed on his uniform. The smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of disbelief. "Mrs. Reynolds," Zoe said, unable to keep a note of triumph from her voice. "This is my dad, Colonel Marcus Mitchell. He works at the Pentagon." Marcus extended his hand. "Mrs. Reynolds, I've heard so much about you." She took his hand automatically, her face pale. "Colonel Mitchell, welcome to Hamilton Academy." "Thank you," Marcus replied smoothly. "Zoe has told me about your interest in her presentations about my work." Mrs. Reynolds's composure, usually unshakable, visibly crumbled. Yes, well, the children sometimes have such creative interpretations of their parents' careers. Indeed, Marcus agreed, though in this case I can assure you Zoe was quite accurate. Before Mrs. Reynolds could respond, the classroom door opened again, and a woman in a dark suit stepped in. She scanned the room, spotted Marcus, and approached with urgent purpose. "Colonel," she said quietly, "there's something that requires your immediate attention." Marcus nodded, then turned back to Mrs. Reynolds. "You'll have to excuse me for a moment. National security matters." He stepped outside with the woman, leaving Zoe standing proudly beside a thoroughly discomforted Mrs. Reynolds, whose condescending smile had frozen on her face. Throughout the classroom, whispers erupted. Jason Whitfield's eyes were wide with astonishment. Emma gave Zoe a thumbs up from across the room, and Mrs. Reynolds stood speechless, her carefully crafted air of superiority shattered by the weight of a single Pentagon badge. Minutes later, Marcus returned, his expression serious but controlled. He whispered something to Mrs. Reynolds, whose face paled even further. She nodded quickly, then turned to address the class. "Class," she announced, her voice slightly higher than normal. "Colonel Mitchell has graciously agreed to give us a brief presentation about his work at the Pentagon." Marcus took his place at the front of the room with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to speaking before much more intimidating audiences. As he began to speak about the importance of intelligence work in keeping the nation safe, the classroom fell silent, every eye fixed on him in rapt attention. Zoe watched her father, pride swelling in her chest. But more satisfying was watching Mrs. Reynolds, who had retreated to the back of the classroom, her earlier smugness replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and awe. For once, the truth had walked into Hamilton Academy, wearing stars on its shoulders, and not even Mrs. Reynolds could deny it anymore. From that day forward, no one at Hamilton Academy ever questioned Zoe Mitchell's word again. And Mrs. Reynolds, though she never explicitly apologized, began treating Zoe with a newfound respect that bordered on deference. As for Colonel Marcus Mitchell, he continued his important work at the Pentagon, though he made more time for school events in the months that followed. Some things were still classified, of course, but Zoe understood better now why her father kept certain parts of his life separate. The black SUVs still occasionally appeared outside their house, but Zoe no longer feared them. They were simply a reminder that her father was someone important, someone who mattered to the safety of the nation, even if most people would never know exactly how much.